The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and regret. I adjusted my black dress, the only decent one I owned, and took a seat in the very last row. Jennifer's funeral home was packed with people who claimed to love my father, but I knew better. I could feel their stares burning into my back like laser beams. "What is she doing here?" Helen whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. My stepmother's voice dripped with the same venom I'd grown accustomed to over the past 15 years. She wore a designer black suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Daniel and Jack flanked her like bodyguards, their expensive suits a stark contrast to my thrift store outfit. They didn't even try to hide their smirks when they saw me. The family Golden Boys, now in their 30s, still acted like the bullies they'd been in high school. I hadn't been invited to my own father's funeral. I found out Leo had died from a neighbor who saw the obituary online. While they were planning the celebration of his life, I was working double shifts at the diner, completely unaware that the man who gave me life had lost his. But here I sat anyway, because despite everything, he was still my father. And they had no idea what surprise was waiting for them in exactly 47 minutes when Michael Davidson, Dad's attorney, would read the will that would flip their world upside down. I was 7 when my world exploded. Mom and Dad's divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of me mattering to anyone. Within 6 months, Dad had moved in with Helen, a blonde real estate agent with 2 sons and an agenda. "Your father needs stability," Helen told me during that first awkward dinner at their new house. "Boys need consistency. You understand, don't you, sweetheart?" The endearment sounded like acid on her tongue. Daniel was 12, Jack was 10, and they immediately established the pecking order. I was the outsider, the reminder of Dad's mistake with my mother. While they got the master bedrooms, I got the converted garage. While they got new clothes for school, I got hand-me-downs from Helen's sister's daughter. School became my refuge, but even there, the differences were obvious. Daniel and Jack showed up to parent-teacher conferences with both Dad and Helen. They got expensive tutors when their grades slipped. They played on traveling sports teams that cost thousands in equipment and travel fees. Me? I walked to school every day because it's good exercise. When I needed help with math, Helen would sigh dramatically and say, "Your father works so hard already. Figure it out yourself." By middle school, the pattern was clear. Christmas mornings were the worst. Daniel would unwrap a new bicycle, Jack would get the latest gaming console, and I'd get a generic sweater from Walmart with the tag still on, clearly purchased last minute. "We can't afford to spoil everyone equally," Helen would say with that fake smile. "Some children need to learn the value of hard work early." Chapter 3, Working While They Played. At 14, I got my first job bussing tables at Mickey's Diner. Not because I wanted spending money for clothes or movies like normal teenagers, I needed it for basic necessities. School supplies, lunch money, even tampons. Helen made it clear that extras weren't in the budget for me. Meanwhile, Daniel was getting a brand new car for his 16th birthday. Jack was taking expensive guitar lessons because he decided he wanted to be a rock star. Dad paid for everything without question. "Look at little Cinderella," Daniel would taunt when I came home exhausted from work, smelling like grease and dishwater. "Maybe if you scrub harder, you'll find a prince." Jack was crueler in his subtlety. He'd leave college brochures around the house, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, places he knew I could never afford. "Dad's already started my college fund," he'd casually mention within earshot. "Some people are just born lucky, I guess." Gatherings from hell. Holidays became endurance tests. Thanksgiving dinners where I sat at the kids' table even when I turned 18. Christmas mornings where my presence was barely tolerated. Birthday parties, theirs, never mine, where I was expected to help serve but not participate. The worst was Jack's high school graduation party. Helen hired caterers, rented a tent, invited what seemed like half the city. I was working at the diner that day, pulling a double shift to save money for my own graduation expenses. When I finally got home at midnight, the party was winding down. The house was full of empty champagne bottles and congratulatory cards stuffed with cash. Jack had received over $3,000 in graduation gifts. My graduation had been 2 weeks earlier. Dad and Helen didn't attend because it conflicted with Daniel's baseball tournament. No party, no gifts, no recognition. Just another day that reminded me where I stood in this family hierarchy. Getting into State University on a partial academic scholarship was the proudest moment of my life. For the first time, someone recognized that I was worth investing in. But even that victory was tainted. Well, it's not Harvard, Helen sniffed when I showed them my acceptance letter. But I suppose it's appropriate for your circumstances. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. Just make sure you can handle the expenses, kiddo. Money doesn't grow on trees. This from the man who had just written a check for Daniel's spring break trip to Cancun. I worked 3 jobs during college, cafeteria, library, and weekend shifts at a local restaurant. My dorm room was smaller than Daniel's walk-in closet back home, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I went to sleep without feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own life. But the family jokes continued. College girl thinks she's better than us now, Jack would say during my rare visits home. Too bad daddy's money can't buy you a personality. Education is so important, Helen would add with mock sincerity. Especially for girls who don't have other advantages. Dad wasn't always the absent father Helen turned him into. I remember fragments of the man he used to be, Saturday morning pancakes when I was little, bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, fishing trips where we'd talk about everything and nothing. But Helen was a master manipulator. She had a way of making every moment between us feel guilty, stolen, wrong. Leo, Daniel needs help with his college applications, she'd interrupt whenever Dad and I started talking. You know how important his future is. Leo, Jack's baseball coach wants to meet with you. Tonight. Tonight, always urgent, always more important than whatever I needed. Slowly, I watched my father disappear behind the husband Helen wanted him to be. The man who used to sneak me extra cookies became someone who barely made eye contact during family dinners. But sometimes, late at night, my phone would ring. Hey, kiddo. How's school going? These calls were our secret. Dad would call when Helen was at her book club or out with friends. We'd talk for hours sometimes, about my classes, my dreams, my fears. He'd tell me about his work, his worries about getting older, his regrets about things he couldn't change. I'm proud of you, he said during one of these calls when I was a junior in college. I know I don't say it enough, but I see how hard you work. I see who you're becoming. Those words meant more to me than any graduation gift ever could have. Dad, I asked one night, do you ever think about how things might have been different? If you and Mom had worked things out. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Every day, he finally whispered. But we can't go backward, kiddo. We can only try to do better moving forward. The calls became more frequent during his last year. At first, I didn't realize anything was wrong. Dad just seemed more reflective. More interested in talking about memories than current events. Then one night, he called crying. I went to the doctor today, he said, his voice breaking. The cancer's back. It spread. Helen didn't want anyone to know. It would just worry people unnecessarily, she told Dad. Let's keep this between us until we know more. But Dad kept calling me. I started driving down every weekend, telling my boss at the restaurant that I had family obligations. I'd arrive Friday night and leave Sunday evening, spending every possible moment with him. We'd sit in his study, Helen's renovated version of what used to be his man cave, and just talk. He told me stories about his childhood I'd never heard. He shared his fears about dying, about leaving things unsaid, about the choices he'd made. "I haven't been a good father to you," he said one Saturday afternoon. We were looking through old photo albums, and he'd stopped at a picture of me in my high school cap and gown, alone. "You did your best," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "No," he shook his head. "I let Helen convince me that loving you less would somehow love them more. But love isn't pie, kiddo. There's always enough to go around." Daniel and Jack knew Dad was sick, but they rarely visited. Daniel was busy with work, his job at Dad's company, the one he'd been handed without interview or qualification. Jack was focused on his music career, the one funded entirely by Dad's monthly checks. Helen was there, but she spent most of her time on the phone with doctors, insurance companies, and funeral directors. Planning, always planning. "Where are your sons?" Dad asked her one afternoon when he was particularly weak. "I'd like to see them." "They'll come when they can," Helen said dismissively. "They're busy building their lives. You understand." But I was there. Every weekend, every holiday break, every time he called and said he was scared or lonely or just wanted to hear a familiar voice. In those final months, we became closer than we'd been since I was 7 years old. He'd hold my hand while he napped, afraid that if he let go, I might disappear like everything else good in his life had. "Promise me something," he said during our last real conversation. He was in the hospital by then, tubes and wires everywhere, but his eyes were still sharp. "Anything, Dad. Promise me you won't let them convince you that you don't matter. You matter more than all of them combined, and someday, everyone will see that." I thought it was just the morphine talking. Michael Davidson had been Dad's attorney for 20 years. He was a small, methodical man who wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in measured tones. Nothing about him suggested he was about to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of my family's expectations. The formal reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock, 1 week after the funeral. Helen had insisted on having it at the family home, Leo's home. She corrected anyone who dared suggest otherwise. They gathered in Dad's study like vultures circling a carcass. Helen sat in Dad's favorite chair, already acting like the widow queen. Daniel and Jack flanked her, checking their phones and making jokes about which cars they'd buy first. I sat in the corner, invisible as always. They'd forgotten I was even supposed to be there until Michael asked directly, "Where's Sarah?" The will specifically requires all beneficiaries to be present. Beneficiaries? Helen's voice was sharp. There must be some mistake. Sarah isn't. She is, Michael said firmly. Shall we begin? Michael opened his briefcase with deliberate precision. Inside was a thick document and a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's handwriting. "The last will and testament of Leo Marcus Williams," he began in his courtroom voice. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby declare this to be my final will, revoking all previous wills and testaments." Standard legal language. Helen was already smiling, mentally redecorating the house. Daniel was calculating his inheritance. Jack was probably planning his first album. To my wife, Helen Williams, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my gratitude for the companionship you provided in my later years. Helen's smile faltered. 50,000. That was nothing compared to what she'd expected. To my stepson Daniel Williams, I leave the sum of $25,000 with the hope that you will finally learn the value of money you've actually earned. Daniel's face went white. What the hell? To my stepson Jack Williams, I leave the sum of $25,000 and the suggestion that you find a career that doesn't depend on other people's money. Jack jumped up. This is insane. He promised us. Please sit down, Michael said calmly. I'm not finished. The room went silent. Everyone was doing the math. That was only $100,000 accounted for. Dad's estate was worth millions. To my daughter, Sarah Williams, I leave everything else. The silence that followed was deafening. Everything else. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. The house and all its contents. The business and all associated accounts. The investment portfolio. The life insurance policies. The vacation home in Colorado. The cars. The jewelry. The art collection. All bank accounts, both checking and savings. All stocks, bonds, and financial instruments. In short, the entire remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $4.2 million. Helen screamed. It wasn't a gasp or a cry of surprise. It was a full-throated scream of rage and disbelief that seemed to echo off every wall in the house. Daniel was on his feet, pacing like a caged animal. This is fraud. She manipulated him. He wasn't in his right mind. Jack was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. You did something. You poisoned his mind against us. But I just sat there, stunned. $4.2 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined in my wildest dreams. Michael pulled out the sealed envelope. There's also a personal letter for Sarah. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note in Dad's careful script. My dearest Sarah. If you're reading this, then my time has come and gone, and you're probably surrounded by people who are very angry right now. Let them be angry. Their anger only proves that I made the right choice. For 15 years, I watched them take everything I offered and demand more. I watched them treat you like you didn't matter, like you were some kind of burden to be endured. But I also watched you. I watched you work 3 jobs to put yourself through college while they complained about their allowances. I watched you visit me every weekend when I was sick while they couldn't find time for a phone call. I watched you love me despite my failures as a father, while they only loved what I could give them. You never asked me for anything, kiddo. Not once. Not money for school, not help with rent, not even a kind word when they were tearing you down. You just loved me, quietly and completely, the way a daughter should love her father. I know I failed you. I let Helen and her boys convince me that there wasn't enough room for everyone in this family, but that was my weakness, not your worth. You were never the problem, Sarah. You were always the solution. This money isn't a gift, it's a debt I'm finally paying. It's 15 years of birthday presents I never gave you, graduation parties I never threw you, college expenses I never helped with, and confidence I never built in you. It's payment for every night you cried yourself to sleep thinking you weren't good enough, when the truth was that you were too good for all of us. Take this money and build the life you deserve. Be generous with people who deserve it, but don't let anyone make you feel guilty for having what I chose to give you. You earned every penny through loyalty and love. I love you, kiddo. I always have. I'm just sorry it took me dying to prove it. Dad. P.S. The key to my safe deposit box is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. Box 447 at First National. There's something special in there for you. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Behind me, Helen was still screaming, Daniel was threatening lawsuits, and Jack was calling me names that would make a sailor blush. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. They gave me exactly 3 days of silence before the assault began. Helen showed up at my apartment at 7 in the morning, looking like she hadn't slept since the wool reading. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her designer clothes wrinkled. We need to talk, she said, pushing past me into my tiny living room. She looked around with obvious disgust, at my second-hand furniture, my milk crate bookshelves, my single window with the crack in the corner. This is ridiculous, she continued, not waiting for me to respond. Your father wasn't thinking clearly. The medication, the pain, it affected his judgment. You know that, don't you? I poured myself a cup of coffee and didn't offer her one. Dad seemed perfectly clear to me. Clear. She laughed bitterly. He left his entire life's work to someone who can't even afford decent furniture. What do you know about running a business? About managing investments? You'll lose everything within a year. Maybe, I said. But that's my choice to make now. Her mask of concerned stepmother finally slipped. Don't be naive, Sarah. This family won't stand for it. Daniel has worked at that company for 5 years. He knows every client, every contract. Jack has connections in the community. They have plans, futures that depend on that money. Then maybe they should have thought about that before they treated Dad like an ATM and me like dirt. Helen's eyes flashed. You ungrateful little bitch. We gave you a home when your mother abandoned you. We included you in this family when we didn't have to. And this is how you repay us. I stood up slowly. For the first time in my life, I was taller than Helen in more than just physical height. Get out, I said quietly. And don't come back. Chapter 14, The Brothers' Approach. Daniel tried the reasonable approach first. He showed up the next evening with a bottle of wine and a folder full of documents. Look, Sarah, I know there's bad blood between us, but we're family, he said, settling into my couch like he owned it. I want to make you an offer. He spread the papers across my coffee table. These are the business contracts for the next 2 years. Dad's company has commitments, obligations. I've been managing the day-to-day operations for years. Without me, the whole thing collapses. He was probably right. I knew nothing about construction management or commercial real estate development. So here's what I'm thinking, he continued. You keep the house, keep $1 million for yourself, that's more money than you'll ever need. I'll take the business and the remaining assets, and I'll pay you a consulting fee of $50,000 a year for life. Everyone wins. And if I say no? His reasonable mask slipped just a little. Then you watch Dad's life work crumble while you fumble around trying to figure out what you're doing. Is that really what he would have wanted? I pretended to consider it. Can I think about it? Of course. But don't take too long. The construction season starts in a month, and decisions need to be made. Jack's approach was different. He showed up drunk at midnight 2 days later, pounding on my door until my neighbors started complaining. You destroyed everything, he shouted when I finally opened the door. 15 years. 15 years I thought of that man as my father, and he leaves me pocket change like I'm some stranger. His breath reeked of whiskey and desperation. Do you know what I gave up for this family? Do you know how many times I defended him when people said he was just a stupid contractor who got lucky? I turned down recording contracts because he said family business came first. This was news to me. What recording contracts? 3 of them. He pushed past me into my apartment. 3 legitimate offers, and I turned them all down because Daddy said I had a future in the family business. And now what? Now I get $25,000 and a lecture about earning my own money. He collapsed onto my couch, crying now. I'm 32 years old, Sarah. Do you know how old that is in music years? I missed my shot. I missed everything for a man who never really loved any of us. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered every cruel word, every dismissive laugh, every time he'd made me feel like nothing. Maybe you should have been nicer, I said. To him. To me. To everyone. He looked up at me with pure hatred. This isn't over. You might have fooled some lawyer and a dying old man, but you won't fool a jury. We're going to prove you manipulated him. We're going to prove he wasn't competent. And when we do, you'll be lucky to get the $25,000 I'm getting now." Within a week, the whispers started. Helen was a socialite with connections throughout the city, and she used every single one of them. At the grocery store, the cashier who used to smile at me suddenly couldn't make eye contact. At the diner where I'd worked through high school, my former boss looked at me like I'd personally betrayed her. "I heard what you did," she said when I stopped by to visit my old coworkers. "Taking advantage of a sick old man. That's low, Sarah. Even for you." The story Helen was spreading was simple and effective: had isolated Dad during his illness, turned him against his loving family, and manipulated him into changing his will. I was the scheming daughter who had stolen a grieving family's rightful inheritance. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "Family Disputes Will of Prominent Businessmen." They interviewed Helen, Daniel, and Jack extensively. Helen came across as the devoted wife, struggling to understand how her husband could have made such an obviously impaired decision. Daniel was the dedicated son, heartbroken that years of loyal service to the family business had been ignored. Jack was the artistic soul, devastated that his father had died thinking so little of him. I was mentioned only as the biological daughter who had been largely estranged from the family. My phone started ringing constantly, reporters wanting my side of the story, lawyers offering to help me manage the situation, and financial advisors who suddenly found me very interesting. But worst of all were the calls from numbers I didn't recognize. People who'd read the story and wanted to tell me what they thought of inheritance-stealing gold diggers. The language they used was creative and horrible. Michael Davidson called me 3 weeks after the will reading. "They filed a formal challenge," he said. "They're claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. It's going to get ugly, Sarah. Are you prepared for that?" Helen had hired Crawford, Martinez and Associates, the biggest law firm in the state. Their lead attorney, Patricia Crawford, was famous for winning impossible cases and destroying opposing witnesses on the stand. "They have resources," Michael warned me. "They can drag this out for years, cost you hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and make your life miserable in the process. Are you sure you want to fight this?" I thought about Dad's letter. About 15 years of being treated like I didn't matter. About Helen's sneer when she called me an ungrateful bitch. About Daniel's certainty that he deserved what I'd been given. About Jack's threats. "I'm sure," I said. But I wasn't. Not really. $4.2 million was life-changing money, but was it worth a war? Before I could think about fighting Helen and the boys, I needed to know exactly what I was fighting for. Dad had mentioned a safe deposit box in his letter, and I'd been carrying the key in my pocket like a talisman. First National Bank was downtown, in a building older than Helen's fake humility. The safety deposit box area was in the basement, all concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. Box 447 was larger than I'd expected. Inside were documents I'd need for the legal battle, medical records proving Dad's mental competency, financial statements, and a thick folder labeled "For Sarah's Eyes Only." But there was also a smaller box, wrapped in tissue paper with a note attached: "This was your grandmother's. She would have wanted you to have it." Inside was the most beautiful necklace I'd ever seen, a string of pearls with a diamond clasp that caught the overhead lights like captured stars. I'd seen it in old family photos, around my grandmother's neck at her wedding, at Dad's christening, at special occasions when jewelry mattered. Helen had always claimed it was lost. There was also a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Love letters from Dad to my mother, written when they were young and still believed in forever. The last one was dated just 3 months before I was born. "I can't wait to meet our daughter, Jenny. She's going to be perfect, just like you. I promise I'll be the kind of father who deserves her love." I sat in that concrete room and cried for the father I'd lost twice, once to divorce and Helen's manipulation, and again to death and regret. While Helen's lawyers were preparing their attack, I was preparing my defense. Not just legal, financial and personal. I sold Dad's vacation home in Colorado. Helen had always hated it, so rustic, she'd complained, but I'd loved our rare trips there when I was little. Now it represented $400,000 in liquid capital that I could use to build something new. I kept the main house but started renovations immediately. Every room Helen had redecorated got stripped back to what it had been when Dad and I were close. The garage where I'd slept as a teenager became a beautiful office overlooking the garden. But I also started investing in myself and others. I paid off my student loans, all of them, including the ones I'd taken to help pay for my mother's cancer treatment 2 years earlier. I bought a reliable car to replace the 15-year-old Honda that had been held together by prayer and duct tape. More importantly, I started Sarah's scholarship fund for kids from difficult family situations. The first recipient was Maria Santos, a 17-year-old whose stepfather had convinced her mother that college was a waste of money for girls. She reminded me of myself at that age, smart, hardworking, and absolutely convinced she wasn't worth investing in. Daniel was right about one thing: I knew nothing about running Dad's construction company. But he was wrong about everything else. I hired Amanda Chin, a business consultant who specialized in family-owned companies in transition. She spent 2 weeks analyzing Dad's business model, meeting with employees, and reviewing contracts. Your stepbrother has been systematically overpaying subcontractors who happen to be his friends, she reported. He's also approved several projects that make no financial sense. This company should be making twice what it's currently generating. I learned that Daniel had been using company funds for personal expenses, his car payments, his golf club membership, even his girlfriend's shopping sprees. All perfectly legal since Dad had essentially given him carte blanche, but incredibly wasteful. The employees don't respect him, Amanda continued. They do good work despite his management, not because of it. Your father's foreman, Carlos Gutierrez, has been essentially running the day-to-day operations while Daniel plays executive. Carlos was a 50-year-old man who'd worked for Dad for 12 years. When I met with him, he was respectful but skeptical. Miss Sarah, I knew your daddy since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, he said. He was a good man who worked hard and treated people fair. Daniel, he's not his father. What would you do if you were running things? I asked. Carlos smiled for the first time. Well, first, I'd stop bleeding money on stupid projects. Then I'd invest in better equipment and training. These boys we got working here are good, but they could be great with the right support. Within a month, I'd promoted Carlos to operations manager and given him a 20% raise. Daniel's office became a break room for the workers. The company's profits increased by 30% in the first quarter. Not everyone believed Helen's version of events. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been Dad's secretary for 15 years, called me a week after the will reading. I just wanted you to know, she said, your father talked about you all the time. Especially these last months. He was so proud of how you turned out, so worried he hadn't done right by you. She had kept copies of every email Dad had sent to Daniel and Jack, unanswered invitations to family dinners, ignored requests for visits, dismissed suggestions that they should spend more time together as a family. Those boys never appreciated what they had, she continued. Too busy with their own lives to notice their father was lonely. But you saw it, didn't you? You came when he needed you. Dr. Martinez, Dad's oncologist, was even more direct when Helen's lawyers contacted him. Leo Williams was cogent and competent right up until his death, he told them. He understood his diagnosis, his prognosis, and his treatment options. There was never any indication of impaired judgment or mental incompetency. He also volunteered information that Helen had tried to keep secret. She had asked him multiple times about having Dad declared mentally incompetent so she could take over his financial decisions. I told her that was both medically and legally impossible, Dr. Martinez said. Leo was dying, but his mind was sharp as ever. If anything, facing death had given him clarity about what really mattered. Patricia Crawford was everything her reputation suggested, sharp, ruthless, and utterly convinced she could tear apart a working-class girl who'd gotten lucky. She filed motion after motion, subpoenaed record after record, and treated every deposition like a war crime tribunal. But discovery is a two-way street. Michael Davidson might have been quiet and methodical, but he was also thorough. While Crawford was trying to prove I'd manipulated Dad, Michael was uncovering the truth about Helen and her sons. The financial records told a story Helen had hoped would stay buried. In the 5 years since Dad's cancer diagnosis, she had systematically moved money into accounts with her name on them. Not stealing, exactly, but positioning herself to inherit as much as possible. More damaging were the recorded phone calls. Dad had been recording his conversations for business purposes for years, a habit Helen had apparently forgotten. The recordings revealed a pattern of emotional manipulation that made my skin crawl. "Leo, you're not being fair to the boys," Helen's voice was honey-sweet on tape. "They work so hard for you, and Sarah just takes. When was the last time she even called to check on you?" This was from a day when I'd spent 6 hours at the hospital with Dad while Helen was getting her nails done. "Maybe it's time to think about what kind of legacy you want to leave," she continued. "Do you want to be remembered as the man who rewarded loyalty or the one who enabled selfishness?" But Dad's responses told a different story. "Sarah calls me every day, Helen. She visited me 4 times this week. Where are Daniel and Jack? They're busy building their careers, the careers you've encouraged. That's what good sons do." There were dozens of these recordings, each one revealing Helen's systematic campaign to turn Dad against me while her sons ignored him completely. Crawford saved me for last, clearly planning to make my deposition the centerpiece of her case. She'd spent months painting me as a manipulative gold digger who'd taken advantage of a sick old man. Now she wanted to prove it in person. The deposition was held in Crawford's conference room, a glass and steel monument to legal intimidation. Crawford sat across from me like a predator sizing up prey. Helen, Daniel, and Jack sat along the wall, watching with hungry eyes. "Miss Williams," Crawford began, "you've claimed you had a close relationship with your father. But according to family members, you were largely absent from his life until his final illness. How do you explain that?" Michael had prepared me for this. "I moved out when I turned 18 because the family dynamic was difficult. But my father and I maintained regular contact through phone calls and visits. Phone calls that no one else in the family knew about. My father chose to make those calls private. You'd have to ask him why." Crawford's smile was razor-thin. "Unfortunately, we can't ask him, can we? How convenient that the only witness to these alleged conversations is dead." That's when Michael played the first recording. Dad's voice filled the room, telling me about his day, asking about my classes, sharing a story about a job site mishap. The timestamp showed it was from 2 years ago, long before his final illness. Crawford's smile faltered. "Miss Williams, you've inherited a substantial sum of money from a man who, according to multiple witnesses, expressed concerns about your lifestyle and choices. Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" "What witnesses?" Michael asked. Crawford hesitated. "Family members who, Michael continued, have already been caught lying under oath about the frequency of their contact with Mr. Williams. I have phone records, hospital visitor logs, and witness testimony proving that Sarah visited her father consistently throughout his illness, while Daniel visited twice and Jack didn't visit at all." Crawford was losing ground, and she knew it. She shifted tactics. "Let's talk about the changes to your father's will. The original will, drafted 5 years ago, left the majority of his estate to his wife and stepsons. This new will, conveniently signed just 3 months before his death, dramatically altered those arrangements. Don't you find the timing suspicious?" I looked directly at Helen when I answered. My father had 5 years to observe who cared about him and who cared about his money. The timing seems perfect to me. You admit you influenced his decision. I admit I loved him. If that's influence, then yes, I'm guilty. Crawford spent 4 more hours trying to trap me in contradictions, but every question she asked only reinforced the truth. I had been the daughter who stayed, while they had been the family who took everything and gave nothing back. The real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison had been Helen's best friend for 20 years, her partner in social climbing and gossiping. But apparently, even friendship has limits. Janet called Michael directly 3 days before the trial was set to begin. I can't let this continue, she said. I've been listening to Helen lie for months, and I can't stand it anymore. I have information about what really happened. Janet had been with Helen the day Dad died. While I was at the hospital holding Dad's hand as he passed, Helen had been at lunch, complaining about how his illness was interfering with her social calendar. She said the stupidest thing, Janet testified in her sworn affidavit. She was talking about the will, assuming she'd inherit everything, and she said, "At least I won't have to pretend to care about that ungrateful little bitch anymore." She was talking about Sarah. But Janet had more than just offensive quotes. She had Helen's own words about her plans for Dad's money. Helen showed me real estate listings during lunch that day. $1 million condos in Florida. She'd already picked out where she wanted to live after Leo died. She said the boys would take over the business, she'd take the liquid assets, and Sarah would get nothing because blood doesn't always mean family. The final nail in Helen's coffin came from her own mouth. Janet had recorded one of their conversations, not maliciously, but because she was trying to learn how to use her new phone and had accidentally left the voice memo app running. In the recording, Helen's voice was crystal clear. Leo's getting sentimental in his old age, talking about fairness and making things right. But I'll contest any will that doesn't benefit my boys. That girl has gotten enough charity from this family. 2 days before the trial, Patricia Crawford called Michael with a settlement offer. My clients are prepared to accept the will as written, she said, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and no pursuit of legal fees. Helen, Daniel, and Jack wanted to avoid a public trial where all their dirty laundry would be aired. They'd realized that the evidence was overwhelmingly against them, and continuing the fight would only make them look worse. But I'd had months to think about this moment. Months to remember every cruel word, every dismissive laugh, every time they'd made me feel like nothing. No, I told Michael. I want the trial. I want everyone to hear the truth. Sarah, Michael said gently, I understand you're angry, but trials are risky. Even with all our evidence, juries can be unpredictable. And the emotional cost. The emotional cost of staying silent is higher, I interrupted. They've spent months telling everyone I'm a manipulative gold digger. I want the chance to tell my side. The trial lasted 6 days. Crawford did her best to portray me as the scheming daughter who'd wormed her way into a dying man's good graces, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard the recorded phone calls between Dad and me, spanning years of genuine conversation and connection. They heard Dr. Martinez testify about Dad's mental competency and Helen's attempts to have him declared incompetent. They heard from Carlos and other employees about how Daniel had mismanaged the company while I'd worked multiple jobs to support myself. Most damaging of all, they heard Janet's recording of Helen planning Dad's funeral before he was even dead, discussing his money like it was already hers. When Helen took the stand, her mask of grieving widow finally slipped completely. Under cross-examination, she admitted she'd never worked a day during her marriage to Dad. She admitted that Daniel and Jack had been financially dependent on Dad well into their 30s. She admitted that she tried to limit my contact with Dad during his illness because she thought I was upsetting him. Upsetting him how? Michael asked. She made him feel guilty, Helen snapped. always talking about her struggles, making him think he wasn't a good father. It wasn't fair to burden a sick man with that kind of emotional manipulation. So showing love and spending time with him was emotional manipulation? She had an agenda. What agenda was that, Mrs. Williams? Helen realized too late that she'd walked into a trap. She wanted his money. But according to your own testimony, Sarah never asked her father for money. She put herself through college, worked multiple jobs, never requested financial help. How exactly was she pursuing his money? Helen had no answer. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Not only did they uphold Dad's will completely, but they also awarded me an additional $200,000 in legal fees, ruling that Helen's challenge had been frivolous and designed purely to harass me. Judge Patricia Morrison delivered the verdict with obvious satisfaction. This case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes family loyalty. The evidence clearly shows that Sarah Williams earned her inheritance through years of genuine love and care, while the contestants demonstrated the very selfishness and entitlement that Mr. Williams sought to address in his final will. The local newspaper that had originally portrayed me as a gold digger ran a front-page story about the trial. Daughter vindicated in will contest, family's true colors revealed. The article detailed Helen's recorded conversations, Daniel's business failures, and Jack's complete absence during Dad's illness. Public opinion, which had been carefully manipulated against me, swung completely in the other direction. Helen left town 2 weeks after the verdict. She moved to Arizona, where her sister lived, and I never saw her again. The $50,000 Dad had left her wouldn't last long without a wealthy husband to support her lifestyle. Daniel tried to start his own construction company using the $25,000 from Dad's will, but without Dad's reputation and connections, he couldn't get clients. Last I heard, he was working as a project manager for someone else's company, making a fraction of what he'd expected to inherit. Jack used his $25,000 to make a demo album that no record company wanted. He moved to Nashville to pursue his music career, but at 32, he was competing against 22-year-olds who'd been working toward the same dream their entire lives. I felt no satisfaction in their failures. If anything, I felt sad for them. They'd had every advantage in life, loving parents, financial security, educational opportunities, but they'd wasted it all on entitlement and cruelty. Something beautiful. With the legal battle behind me, I could finally focus on building the life Dad had wanted me to have. I kept his construction company but transformed it into something that reflected my values. We started taking on projects for nonprofit organizations at cost. Habitat for Humanity builds, community center renovations, playgrounds for underfunded schools. Carlos became my full partner in the business, and we hired primarily from disadvantaged communities, people who needed the job training and steady income. Your daddy would be proud, Carlos told me as we watched our crew finish a new playground at an elementary school in the poorest part of town. He always said business should make the community better, not just make money. Sarah's scholarship fund grew from my personal project into a registered nonprofit. We'd helped 23 young people attend college by the end of the second year, kids from broken homes, abusive families, and impossible financial situations. Maria Santos, our first scholarship recipient, called me from her dorm room at State University. I got into the engineering program, she said, crying with joy. Full scholarship for my junior and senior year. I'm going to design buildings, Miss Sarah. Real buildings that will help people. You're going to change the world, I told her, and I meant it. 2 years after the trial, I bought a house on the coast. Not a mansion, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore, but a comfortable home with large windows that faced the ocean and enough space for the family I hope to build someday. The house came with a story. It had belonged to an elderly woman named Rose who'd spent 50 years there with her husband. After he died, she couldn't maintain it alone, but she refused to sell to developers who wanted to tear it down and build condominiums. I wanted to go to someone who'll love it, she told me during our first meeting. Someone who understands what it means to have a real home. I hired Carlos's crew to renovate it, keeping all the character but updating the systems. The kitchen where Rose had cooked thousands of meals became my office, where I managed the scholarship fund and planned community projects. The garden where she'd grown vegetables became a meditation space where I could think and plan and just breathe. But the best part was the guest room, a bright, sunny space where scholarship recipients could stay when they needed to get away from family drama or just wanted a quiet place to study. "This is what home should feel like," said Marcus, a 19-year-old whose parents had kicked him out for choosing college over the family business. He spent his spring break at my house, studying for finals and learning to cook in Rose's old kitchen. Safe, I agreed. Home should always feel safe. I met David at a charity auction for literacy programs. He was bidding on a weekend at a mountain cabin, and I was bidding on a collection of first-edition children's books for the scholarship program's library. He outbid me on the books. "I'm sorry," he said afterward, approaching me with a sheepish smile. "I didn't realize they were for charity. Please, let me donate them to your program." David was a pediatrician who ran free clinics in underserved communities. He understood what it meant to work for something bigger than yourself. He'd grown up poor, put himself through medical school, and never forgot where he came from. Our first date was volunteering together at a food bank. Our second was helping Carlos's crew build a wheelchair ramp for a disabled veteran. By our third date, I realized I'd never been with someone who shared my values so completely. "I've never met anyone like you," he told me 6 months into our relationship. "You could buy anything, go anywhere, do anything, but you choose to spend your time helping people who can't help you back. Why?" I thought about Dad's letter, about feeling worthless for so many years, about the kids in our scholarship program who reminded me of myself. "Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten," I said. "And I never want anyone else to feel that way." David proposed on the beach behind my house, with a ring he designed himself, simple and beautiful, like our relationship. The wedding was small, just close friends and scholarship recipients, held in Rose's garden under string lights and stars. Dad would have loved David. He would have loved seeing me finally surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. 5 years after Dad's death, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Daniel. "Sarah," his voice was different, humbler, tired. "I know I have no right to call you, but I wanted to. I needed to apologize." He was calling from rehab. After his business failed, his girlfriend left him for someone with better prospects. He'd started drinking heavily, then using cocaine to stay functional during job interviews. Eventually, he'd lost everything. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad," he said. "About how we treated you. About how we treated him. I was so angry about the will, but now I understand why he did it." "Daniel. No, let me say this. You were the only one who loved him without expecting anything back. We treated him like a bank account, but you treated him like a father. He saw that, and we were too selfish to see what he saw." I listened to him cry for several minutes. "I'm not asking for money," he finally continued. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that you were right, and we were wrong, and I'm sorry it took me losing everything to figure that out." "Daniel," I said gently, "everyone deserves a second chance. When you get out of rehab, if you want to start over, really start over, call me. I might know someone who needs a construction worker who's willing to learn humility along with the trade." 6 months later, Daniel joined Carlos's crew at the bottom, carrying tools, cleaning job sites, learning the trade from the ground up. He was 40 years old, starting over like a teenager, but he worked harder than men half his age. "I'm not asking to be family again," he told me after his first month on the job. "I know I don't deserve that. But I want you to know I'm trying to become the person Dad thought I could be." "We're all trying," I said. That's what makes us human. Jack never called. Last I heard, he was still in Nashville, still believing that success was just one lucky break away. Some people never learn, and that's their choice. Helen passed away 3 years after the trial. Her sister called to let me know, asking if I wanted to attend the funeral. I sent flowers but didn't go. I'd said everything I needed to say to Helen while she was alive. But the scholarship program kept growing. By the 10th anniversary of Dad's death, we'd helped over 100 young people attend college. Doctors, teachers, engineers, social workers, kids who'd been written off by their families but refused to write themselves off. The construction company had become one of the most respected in the region, known for quality work and fair treatment of employees. Carlos had become like a father to me, and his son Miguel was studying business so he could help expand our community outreach programs. Miss Sarah, Carlos said as we watched Miguel graduate from college, "Your papa, he's watching all this, and he's proud. This is what he wanted his money to do, make good things grow." I still lived in the house by the sea, though David and I had added onto it as our family grew. Our daughter Emma was 3, with Dad's eyes and David's gentle nature. Our son Leo, named for his grandfather, was 1 year old and already showing signs of being as stubborn as I was. Sometimes, at night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the waves, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. From the unwanted daughter sleeping in a converted garage to a woman who could give other unwanted daughters the chances they deserved. 10 years after that funeral where I sat in the back row, I was invited to speak at the university's graduation ceremony. Not as Sarah Williams, the girl who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for school, but as Dr. Sarah Williams, who'd earned an honorary doctorate for my work in community development and youth advocacy. The auditorium was full of young people who looked like I had at their age, uncertain, hopeful, scared, and determined. In the front rows sat 23 scholarship recipients, wearing caps and gowns that represented dreams my family had once told them were impossible. 10 years ago, I inherited more money than I'd ever imagined. But the real inheritance wasn't the money, it was the lesson my father finally taught me about who deserves our love and loyalty. I looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that reminded me of my younger self. Some of you come from families who believe in you. Cherish that, it's a gift. But some of you come from families who don't. Who've told you that you're not smart enough, not good enough, not worth investing in. I'm here to tell you that families can be wrong. The scholarship recipients were crying now, and so was I. You get to choose who you become. You get to choose what your legacy will be. And if your family can't see your worth, then build a new family with people who can. After the ceremony, Maria Santos, now Maria Santoshin, a structural engineer with her own firm, hugged me tightly. "You saved my life," she whispered. "No," I said, "I just gave you the chance to save your own." That night, David and I sat on our porch while Emma and Leo slept peacefully inside. The ocean was calm, the stars were bright, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely at peace. "Do you ever think about them?" David asked. "Helen, Jack, what they're doing now?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not with anger anymore. They taught me something important too." "What's that?" I smiled, thinking about Dad's letter, about all the young people we'd helped, about the life I'd built from the ashes of their cruelty. "They taught me that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies," I said. "It's building a life so beautiful that their opinions become irrelevant." The waves whispered against the shore, and somewhere in that sound, I heard Dad's voice. "Well done, kiddo. Well done." They mocked me for years, calling me worthless, ungrateful, a burden on the family. They laughed when I worked multiple jobs while they lived off Dad's money. They sneered when I chose education over their approval. But now I don't even think of their names without smiling. I own everything they wanted, but more importantly, I've become everything they said I could never be. Successful. Respected. Loved by people who matter. The greatest victory wasn't inheriting Dad's money, it was proving that worth isn't determined by the people who raised you. It's determined by the choices you make and the lives you touch. They thought they knew who deserved what. They were spectacularly, beautifully, completely wrong. Life has a way of giving everyone exactly what they've earned. Sometimes it just takes a while for the accounting to balance out. The end.